Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on artifact analysis and timelining with KAPE. We'll soon hear from our speaker, Mary DeGrazia, but I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items before we start. First, know that this session is being recorded. You will all receive a link to the recording video tomorrow. We'll try to save time in the session for Q&A at the end. So feel free to submit your questions using the chat function of the GoToWebinar client, and we'll do our best to answer them right now. If we can't answer them today, there's a lot of people here, we'll try and follow up via email later. And also in the GoToWebinar client, you will find the handout section, which we loaded some downloadable assets there you may find relevant. Now, I'm pleased to pass the mic over to Mary to kick off our session.
Great, thank you, Leo, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is that you are dialing in from. So I'm super excited to talk about what we're going to be talking about today. Specifically, it's going to be timelining with KAPE. We will be covering artifact analysis, but more as it pertains to timelining. And the reason why I'm so excited about this is because timelining is something that I literally do in every single case that I work, and I could not imagine working a case without it. So when KAPE came out, this was something that I wanted to integrate into KAPE so that I could use my timelining process along with the capabilities of KAPE. So a little bit of background information about myself. I am an Associate Managing Director, or AMD, at Kroll. So this means at Kroll that I get to lead a team of investigators through various cases. And right now, as everybody probably know, ransomware is like what's hot right now. So we're working a lot of ransomware cases. I also do PFI investigations, IP theft, network intrusion, APT, just the whole gamut of things. I've been in the industry now for about 20 years, specializing in digital forensics and incident response for about the last 10 years. I'm also a SANS instructor where I teach the Windows Forensic Analysis. And if you want to hit me up on Twitter, you can get me right there at Mary DeGrazia. So just a little bit of background information about myself before we dive into today. Okay, what is our overview? Where are we going to go with this in the next half an hour? As you can imagine, I think a half hour is great, right? Nice bite-sized chunk of information to take away. We're going to talk about this concept of triage collection versus taking an image, which is what KAPE really excels at. Then we're going to talk about how we're going to take that data collection, take the data from KAPE and turn that into what's called a mini timeline. So we're not talking about analyzing all of the things. We're talking about focusing in on the core artifacts that we need for our case so that we can get our answers fast. And then we're going to talk briefly about how we do analysis with that timeline that's created. There's a lot of really cool things if you haven't done timelining before that timelining can really help out with, like building connections in your cases and maybe finding new artifacts that you wouldn't have even have thought of looking at before. So kind of what are we not talking about? So there is, KAPE is, a great program and there are a lot of features to it. And here at Kroll, we also offer what we call our intensive training. So that's really where you kind of get to peek behind the curtains of KAPE, see how it works, learn how to write targets and modules, kind of everything about KAPE, and we also have a certification that goes with that. So if after today you find yourself thinking, gee, I'd like to learn more about KAPE, I'd like to really get more hands-on with it, I can see how I can use this in my environment, and I want to learn how to do that, please go to that URL down there and sign up. We do keep it capped at 25 students so that it's nice and hands-on. We have a lot of labs in this, so it's not being talked to all day. You're actually going to get hands-on in your labs and do a lot of things. So moving on to today's topic. When we talk about timeline analysis, the approach that we're going to take is very targeted. When we think about forensics and all the different kind of cases that we can work, right? So now kind of the flavor of the month of if you will, or the last several months have been ransomware cases. A few years ago, I was working a lot of cases with POS breaches, and a year or so ago, it was Office 365. When we think about each one of these type of cases, there are usually very specific artifacts to that particular case. So for instance, when I first started my career many years ago, I was working, unfortunately, a lot of child pornography cases. So the artifacts that I look at for something like that might be really based on internet history and utilities used to download files like that. When we switch to ransomware, now I'm thinking more about how is an attacker moving laterally throughout the environment? How did they compromise the network? Did they get in through RDP? So I'm not as interested in internet history. Sure, I might want to go take a look at that, but when I start thinking about the key questions to my case, I can usually really focus in on a handful of artifacts that are relevant and important to my investigation. So with this approach, with the MiniTimeline, with KAPE, we're thinking, you know, we're going to do that sniper approach instead of like the shotgun approach. We're not going to try and get all of the things. We're going to try and get things that are relevant to our case so that we can get answers quick and fast. Okay, so what are those artifacts? So the main one and the main three that we're going to be dealing with today as it relates is the file system, right? We're talking about files that have been created on the system, files that have been deleted on the system. This is what we call the MFT in forensics, the master file table. That's going to give us, you know, our modified access, created, born dates. It can even give us visibility into things like a zone identifier if something was downloaded from the internet. And the MFT can also contain references to deleted files. So just within a file that might be 500 megs in size, we get a ton of information. So if we think about taking a full disk image in terabytes and terabytes of data, really, you know, this MFT 500 megs, boop, nice small file, lots and lots of information. One of my most favorite artifacts is registry. Now the registry tracks so much of what a user does on the system. So we talk about things like recent documents that have been opened up by a user, applications that have been, you know, executed on the system, and we can even tie that to a particular user. Things like the USR class, the NT user.dat hive, the SAM system security hive. So the registry gives us a wealth of information into the system as well. And finally, our friends, the event logs. I know a lot of people kind of groan when they hear about event logs, but they contain so much important information. You know, when we talk about somebody logging into a system or coming in externally through RDP, we're going to see that in the event logs. So these are the three core artifacts that we're going to be talking about today that we're going to use in our timeline analysis. And with just these three, you can answer, you know, tons and tons of questions. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't take an image of a system. This is just one approach to it so that you can start working quickly and efficiently. All right, so KAPE Basics. When we talk about KAPE, the way that KAPE works is we have something called targets and modules kind of at the core of it. The targets tell you what information it is that you want to collect from the system, which I just went over right here in this slide. So we need to tell KAPE what to collect, and we do that with what's called target files. Next, we want to process that data, and to process that data, we use something called modules, and modules will say, okay, now that I have this MFT, how are you going to parse out that data? And we'll be talking about a tool in a minute that will do that, as well as the registry hives and the event logs. And I'll be showing those in more detail in a few minutes here. So KAPE can be ran against either a mounted image. So if you've already had a collection and you already have an image, you can mount that up, excuse me, using something like Arsenal Image Mounter, or you can run KAPE externally from a USB drive. One limitation, if you will, of KAPE is that it is designed for Windows systems to run with the .NET framework. So if you're talking something about a live system or running it on a mounted image, you know, that would be from a Windows platform, maybe not something like Linux unless you're running a VM inside of that. So we have lots of options when we use KAPE. So let's dive in and talk about this triage collection, this concept of collecting just what we need to for our investigation. So one of the really cool things about KAPE, and I'm going to be talking about them in a minute here, are these targets and the modules. These are open source. These are written by the community. So if you're working a case or you've been working cases and like, you know what, I really find that the SHRM has been very valuable to see data exfiltration. I need a target for that. You can use this little sync with GitHub button and pull down all the targets and modules that have been written by the community, or you can write one yourself. And I think there are like well over 100 different target modules that have been written either by Eric Zimmerman or the community. So to that end, I wrote my own target that collects this information that I've talked about. So I'm going to pop in here real quick and just show what that looks like. So let's see, desktop, KAPE. So right here, I'm going to launch what's called GKAPE. So the nice thing about KAPE is that it has not only a GUI, but it has a command line. So if you're looking to automate your processes, you can absolutely use KAPE to do that. And what's really cool is you'll see right here, it's going to build out the command line as we go. So I'm going to just filter this out real quick, MiniTimeline collection, to show what's collected. So with each target, it's just written in what's called YAML, yet another markup language, pretty intuitive to understand. You know, there's a little comment up here that tells you what it collects. So in my target, you can see I have event logs, I have the file system, and I have the registry hives defined. So those are the 3 artifacts I talked about that I wanted collected. Now, the way that targets work is that they can actually call other targets. So you can have a very modular system built out. So maybe when I collect registry hives, I'm only interested in the system registry hives, and I don't want to get all the into user.dat hives because, you know, 50 users have logged into a system, and that's not what I'm interested in. So for instance here, this references another target called registryhives.tcape. So if I go in and actually look for that, so I'm just going to put in registry hives, you can see right here, I have the main one, the registry hives, that calls both of the ones down here. One's for the system and one's for the users. So the concept is that when you build out your targets, you can do it in a very modular approach. Okay, so going back here to my MiniTimeline, once again, I have the event logs, the file system, which is the MFT, and my registry hives defined. So I'm just going to click yes, that is definitely what I want to collect. Okay, so now right now I'm just working off of an image, but you can also do run KAPE against a live system from an external drive. To work with our images, I'm going to be using a program called Arsenal Image Mounter to load up the image. And what's nice about Arsenal Image Mounter versus some of the other programs like FTK Imager is it gives us access to what our volume shadow copies are. And KAPE supports volume shadow copies. We're not going to get into that today. That's covered more in the intensive training, but just know that when you use Arsenal Image Mounter, it's going to give you access to this. So to see what drive letters the image has been mounted to, I just click on this and expand it, and it's going to show me my mount points, so G and H. Now G is just a system partition, but H is the one I'm interested in. This is the one that has, you know, my users. This is the one that has my Windows directory, all that fun stuff in it that we like as examiners. So I know that I've got my image mounted up as H, so now I need a target source. KAPE needs to know where to go pull that information for the collection. So for target source, I'm going to go down and I'm going to choose that H drive because that's where I want to collect my data from. The destination is, you know, where is this going to go? Where do I want to store the data that I'm going to collect? So I'm just going to put this right at the root of C and just call it KAPE out for my output. Now, if you're running this, yep, that's fine. I already have that folder. If you're running this from a live system, of course, you would have everything on, you know, your external drive, and then you would save that output onto your external drive. You're not going to want to be saving it on the computer that you're doing the collection on. So once I've specified that, I can also specify what kind of container I want it in. I can do a zip file, VHDX, VHD. Just to keep things simple for right now, I'm just going to say none. I'm just going to dump it right out into that. As I was going through, you can see that it built out the command line for me. So in the event that I like this process and I want to use it moving forward, I can just put something like this into a batch file and run it as necessary. So once I have everything selected here, once again, use target options. Oh, the flush option. If you hover over this, you're going to see a tooltip. It's basically going to delete everything that's in that directory. So dealer's choice if you want to do that or not. Sometimes I tend not to, just because I'm afraid I might pick the wrong directory and accidentally delete a lot of information. So you can leave this checked, unchecked, whatever you want to do. Okay, so now that I have this all defined, I'm going to hit execute. Warning, flush options are enabled, that's fine. It's all going to see KAPE out. Now you'll see KAPE run in the background and it's going to do the collection. And what's nice about this is KAPE is able to copy out what we call locked files. So if you're doing a collection on a live system, files that are normally locked for copying with the normal copy command, like the registry, Hive, the web cache, event logs, things like that, KAPE will go in and do a raw copy, if you will, and copy out that data, so you don't have to worry about that. So what does it look like when it's done the collection? So if I go into C, KAPE output, you can see right here is the data that it collected, and I've got a nice log file, and then it recreates the directory structure of the collection that just happened. So you can see here I go H, Windows, System32, config. Here are all my registry hives, and as you can see, the log files were also included. Same with the Windows event logs, so on and so forth. So that's just kind of going over the target collection and using KAPE to do that with the MiniTimeline collection right here. Okay, so, and I showed what those look like. So let's kind of talk about this issue. This elephant in the room with forensics, right? A lot of times in forensics, we have to use so many different tools to look at our data. We have tools like X-Ways, where you can open up an image, run your keyword searches, filter, sort, find interesting files. And, if you're working a case, ultimately at some point in time, you're going to have to share your findings with somebody, right? Whether it's your manager who then passes on the information, or it's a client and you have to write a report. So there's this concept of data munging that happens. And I swear, in addition to all the forensic tools that we use, Excel is probably right up there, right? Because we are copying and pasting our findings as we go along. Like, oh, look, I found this recent document that was opened up. I'm going to put that in my timeline. And oh, look, I see this malware executed. I'm going to copy and paste that and put that in here. So we kind of go through this process where we're copying and pasting from a variety of different applications. So right here is Registry Explorer, another tool by Eric Zimmerman. So you go in here and you use this plugins and you find, a lot of recent documents that were opened up or typed URLs. You can export it out to CSV, you look through it, and you find something cool, and now you got to go copy and paste that into the timeline that you're kind of building out for your report. The same thing when we use tools like RegRipper, which gives us output in a nice text file. So as you can see here, I have all these different types of timestamps that I'm dealing with, right? Some are month, day, year, some are written out in a long format. So I copy and paste this into my Excel sheet, and then I have to change it to 811 manually, or I do some kind of funkiness, thing in Excel, and it normalizes all the data for me. And next thing you know, we feel like we're spending more time kind of data munging everything that we're finding to get it into this nice human readable format for our reports. So here's just another example. If we're looking at event logs, here's actually a PowerShell script that is embedded inside an event log, your fileless malware, if you will. So just kind of, flipping through, looking at all these different tools that we use for our analysis, it just kind of is a headache to deal with. So why timelines? Like, why are we talking about this today? One, we get to combine all of our artifacts into one place, right? So instead of using something like Registry Explorer and then RegRipper and then X-Ways and Event Viewer to view our event logs, we have at our disposal with KAPE and these tools a way to combine all of these artifacts into one place. In addition to that, it's going to normalize the timestamps. So if you're in an environment where maybe you have your servers in one location and end users kind of scattered out throughout the country, a lot of times you end up having to kind of normalize all your timestamps. And as examiners, UTC is kind of our go-to time zone, right? We don't have to worry about daylight savings times, all of that kind of stuff. Not only that, but sometimes some tools will output things in different time zones. Maybe they process it in local time zone instead of UTC. The really cool thing about timelines is it helps you build these connections. So now, instead of kind of going and looking at all your artifacts in different places, now you can actually kind of pivot into when something happens. So it's like, okay, I can see this malware launched in the user assist in my registry key. But I want to know, how did that person connect into the system to do that? Did they log in locally? Did they come in through RDP? So, you might jump over and you have to go look at your event logs and you have to filter by the date. But now in a timeline, as soon as you see that user assist happen, you can just scroll up and down your timeline to see what happened, which lets you build out these really cool connections, because now you're going to start noticing things that you may not have known to go look for. So for example, if malware executes on the system, you might see in an installed service, and then you might see a run key, and then you might see it actually modify the registry where it alters the firewall. So what happens is, instead of kind of being responsible for going out and doing and looking at all these different things, because it's in this timeline, it's all there for you. And then next, of course, is reporting. It's going to make it so much easier now that this timeline is kind of already made to like copy and paste everything and put it into your report. Okay, so timeline format. What is the TLN format? So when we talk about the TLN format, we need to normalize all this data. So we get 5 fields that we deal with. We get time, okay, epoch, timestamp, 32-bit, source. Where did this come from? Was it the event log, the registry, the host? Okay, what system? The user, okay, if there's a user associated with it, I want the user. And then last but not least, the description. So an event log, that would be like 4624, someone logged in. All right, so what does this look like after we have created it? So right here, you can see I have an example of, I've got the timestamp right here. Let's see, my little pointer is not working. Okay, so we've got the timestamp over here. We've got the system, the user, and the description. So right here, you can see I have a program execution, user assist, a notepad, and then scrolling up through my timeline, I can see that I have a type 3 4634, which tells me that it was a login over the network. And then here I can see that I have a prefetch file also for notepad.exe. So this is kind of how our timeline, the final form of our timeline, will look when we get done running through KAPE to create our timeline. So there are a lot of tools out there that have the TLN format. A lot of Harlan Carvey's tools support it. So when we talk about things with the registry, you're going to get that in TLN format. Palazzo, which is also free, that is actually another tool that's used to create timelines. It can output things into TLN format. And there's a suite of tools made by TZ Works that are commercial that will also output into this standardized format of the TLN format. So in this particular instance, there are tools that I call on the back end with my module to create the timeline. The first one is one that will go through and parse out the MFT, and that uses Eric's tool MFTE command. It actually outputs it into something called a body file, which is another file format. On the back end, I go ahead and convert that into the TLN format. For the registry, we're going to get the last modified time of every single registry key that's been created. In addition to that, I run RegRipper with some TLN plugins. So for instance, when we talk about stuff like shell bags, it's going to go in and pull out and give us additional visibility into that, typed URLs, things of that nature. For event logs, we have two different tools because depending on the operating system, you might have EVT files, older operating systems, or the newer format, the EVTX. And then finally, at the end of everything, it's going to go through two additional tools. Some of these tools output into Unicode. Some of them can only handle ASCII, so I end up calling two additional tools. One converts everything from Unicode to ASCII, and at the very end, we use a tool called parse.exe that does everything. The nice thing is you don't have to know all this. You can just run my modules, and it's going to do this all in the background. Okay, so what modules are you going to use to do this? The module name is going to be MiniTimeline. And for this one, we're going to add in a variable called the computer name so we know what computer this came from. The other one we're going to use is called slice by date range. So typically, if I'm looking at a computer, I'm interested in a very specific time range. So it's a lot easier to make it manageable to work with. I'm just going to take a smaller chunk to look at. So, you know, it's quicker to search through, quicker to look at, so on and so forth. All right, so what does this look like? So here I've got KAPE. I'm going to press this to exit out and pull this up. So right here, I've already gone through my target options. Now I'm going to use my modules. So remember, targets collect, modules process. So my module source is now going to be basically where I dumped that collection. So that's going to be C KAPE out. My module destination, that's going to be where my outputs are going to be stored. So I'm going to go into C KAPE timeline. I just want to put it there. And then right here, I'm going to go choose the mini timeline. Oh, you know what? I want to go with my name field right here. Timeline, mini timeline. So right here is my mini timeline module. And if I double click this, you can see these are all the different tools that I am calling right here. So with my mini timeline, it does tell me that I need a variable. And if you hover over this, it tells you that add in key computer name. So if I go down here to key computer name, and then right here, I've already entered them in, so I'm not going to retype them, but here you would need to manually type this in, and then I'm going to click add. The same thing for the date range. If I click this and hover over it, it's going to tell me that I need a date range, and then it also supplies the format of that date range that I need. So right here, I'm going to pick this one because I just know that it is relevant for my investigation. So right here, I've got all the outputs created. You can see that it builds out this timeline. So once again, if this is something that I want to automate on the back end, I can certainly do that. So I'm going to go ahead and execute it, run it. It's going to kick off in the background, and it's going to start processing this data. Typically, the two things that are going to take the longest to process can be event logs, because there can be hundreds of event logs on a system. And the MFT can sometimes take a while. I have a pretty small image here, so it's just going to take a matter of seconds. But typically, I find that this can take anywhere from 20 minutes to maybe an hour if you have a lot of event logs. But it's still a pretty quick process that happens in the back end. So if I go in here and look at my timeline outputs, this is going to be my main timeline right here, this 01 timeline. Underneath that, I have my date range, 01 timeline date range. I put the ones in front of them so they kind of bubble up to the top. The rest of these are just kind of working files that are created through this whole process of data munging the information. So got a couple minutes left. Let's talk about how to analyze this timeline. This file has been modified. Yes, I want to reload it. Actually, let's do this. So I make sure I have everything recent. Close all and reopen my timeline. I like to use Notepad++ for this. You, of course, can use anything that you want to, Excel, Timeline Explorer, another tool by Eric Zimmerman. So typically when we talk about timelines, we have a pivot point. We're looking for something. So in a lot of environments, something that I like to look for is something called PSExec usage. It's a remote command. It's a remote tool that you can use to push out information. So I just do a quick search in my timeline for PSExec. And right here, you can see I have a registry entry because once again, we're pulling in, I've used RegRipper to pull out the shim cache, atcom cache entries. So if I just double click on this, it drops me right into the timeline, and then I can start scrolling up and down within my timeline to see what else I can see. So if I kind of go up a little bit here, I can see, you know, I have a successful login from a remote host. And if I keep on going up in my timeline to see, okay, what else happened around this PS exec? I can see that I have something called install.exe that was ran. The next thing, if I keep going up, I can see that there was a suspicious file called mswinhost.exe that was created in this app data roaming folder, which is an unusual place when we talk about executables for them to be found in a location like this. So I can keep kind of going up further in my timeline to see, you know, what else might be going on. So here I have a prefetch file now for this suspicious file. And then right after it, I have a run key. So right here, I might have a persistent mechanism. So potentially just by, you know, jumping in, pivoting through the timeline, I can start to make all these different connections of what is going on with timelining. So that brings us to our half hour. I know that was pretty quick, but I think we covered everything that we needed to. The targets that you need to, you know, collect the data for the timeline, the targets or the modules that you need to create the timeline on the end, why we want to use timelines, right? We want to normalize that data. We want to get it all into one place. There's a little bit of setup that needs to be done to get that going. You have to have the binaries to run this, and they're defined within each of the modules where you can find them. And I actually have some links here at the end where you can download the specific tools. Kroll distributes KAPE, but we of course do not distribute everybody else's tools in the community that develops. You're kind of responsible to go out and grab those so that you can run it all together. So that brings us to the end of our half hour together. So thank you for joining me today, learning all about timelines. I have time to stick around and answer questions. If you have time to stick around and ask them, I'm more than happy to do so. Today was just like a brief intro to KAPE, but if you want to learn more, we have, you know, full days of training for that. So with that, I will turn it back over to Leo, our moderator.
Yeah, Mary, this was awesome. Thank you so much. It's quite a lot to unpack. We do have a great amount of questions. I'm going to try and do my best and pick the ones in order that they came in. So please be patient, and we'll try and answer as many as we can and follow up via email later. So one question that has been coming in very frequently now is, will you be sharing the timeline targets and modules that you covered today?
Yes, so those, great questions. So there is this get sync, right here, sync with GitHub. As soon as you update using this, it will pull down all of the targets and modules that are up on this GitHub site. And all of mine are right in here. So if you just make sure that you have the most recent version of KAPE and you run the sync with GitHub, you will get both this target here and you will get these two right here that call a bunch of these other ones here. The only thing that you will not get are the binaries, which is the thing that you have to go and install yourself. And those are defined right here. It tells you within each one of these where you need to go and download the binaries from, which is this link right here. These go in what is called the binary folder for KAPE. So once you get those binaries, you're going to pop them right into, there's this modules directory and binary right here. I also have a blog post that kind of walks through and details how to kind of get KAPE set up and configured for this. So Mary DeGrazia, blog, KAPE. Let's see if that'll pull it up quick for me. So I have a blog post right here, and if you click down through them, triage and timeline generation with KAPE, you can go there and it'll walk you through step by step kind of where you need to go to download this and how to get it installed and working.
Wow, thanks, Mary. One other question that came in from Sebastian was, can can I use FTK Imager to mount the image?
Yes, you can absolutely use FTK Imager to mount an image, but just be aware that if you use FTK Imager to mount an image, you don't get access to those volume shadow copies. So if volume shadow copies are something that you want visibility into, make sure that you use AIM for that, but you can still use FTK Imager to mount an image and use KAPE. It's not the preferred way, but you can still do it.
Thank you. We got two questions around remote collection, Mary. I know this can be complicated, but they're asking if there's a preferred method for remote collection, such as an enterprise network using KAPE.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of options for that. We covered this a little bit more in our intensive training, but there's this button here. Let me see if I can get it to go transfer. So there are a couple ways that you can do this. So at Kroll, in our cases, we leverage something called Carbon Black. With Carbon Black, we have endpoints that go out onto systems, and we can use something called live response, where we go in and we basically do what you see here. We just run a command line syntax, and it pulls that information back to us. Now there are other options here. Eric also has the ability to set up and run an SFTP server. So you can do something like however you might push out something in your environment, like through a batch file. You can push out a batch file, you can run KAPE, and then you can actually have it connect into an SFTP server, AWS, Azure, and you can push that information out that way. So as long as your system support .NET, you can absolutely run KAPE like within an enterprise situation. However, you might run like typical command line tools and just have it do that collection and push it up out into the cloud or an SFTP server within your environment.
Thanks, Mary. Let's do a couple more. I think there's a quick one asking, do you know if there will be a version of KAPE that can run on Mac OS or Linux?
So I don't think that's in the works anytime soon. I know that Eric develops mainly in the .NET platform, so that's not something that I anticipate anytime soon. But there are some ways that you could kind of, make things work. For instance, you can get something like, something that would support mounting HFS plus systems, so on and so forth. You kind of get those drivers on the back end to mount the image, and then you could write your own targets and modules to do your own type of processing on, the Mac artifacts and the Linux artifacts if you're wanting that kind of stuff done. But natively, it's not really written to do that on Linux or Mac systems.
Okay. Another interesting question came in from Edward. First of all, he says meow. And then
yeah, I love it.
And then he asks if KAPE also supports AESP similar to CANSA.
Can you type that in the chat window? I'm not sure I quite caught that. Does it support AESP
similar to CANSA?
Oh, that's it. I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. Now I'm going to have to get back to you about that.
Okay. All right. Let's do one more. This has come in a few minutes ago from Jason. He's asking, is it possible to pass artifact locations as arguments at runtime, or do you need to know the exact location when you write the module?
That's a great question. So there are a lot of different ways that you can write modules or targets when you're doing the collection. You can use wildcard characters. I'm trying to think of some good examples in here. So like for instance, let's see. Chrome, let's see if there's a good. So here, like if you're specifying user, you don't have to specify an exact user path. You can use wildcards, you can use matching, you can use percent signs. You can see right here is, another wildcard. You can specify if you want to recurse or not recurse, if it's a directory, or you can give it a direct path to a file. So potentially, you could go through and look for and get all the Word documents, something of that nature.
Great. Mary, I think we covered quite a bit. There's still a lot of questions, but we'll try and follow up with everyone via email. Would you mind sharing your Twitter again and perhaps Eric's Twitter handle for folks to get the latest on KAPE?
Yes, I don't know Eric's offhand. It's probably at Zimmerman. Let me Google it real quick. But there's my information.
Perfect. And I'll again just thank everyone for attending and staying on. There's still quite a few folks on the session, even though we're over time. So thank you for attending. For further questions on KAPE, of course, you can reach out to Mary or Eric. They're both on Twitter. And you can also reach out to kape@kroll.com, where Mary, Eric, and other KAPE experts are available to answer questions and offer some support. Mary, any last words before we close?
No, just to go out there and forensicate and go catch them, right? So it was my pleasure talking to everybody. And just to reiterate what Leo said, please, if you have any questions, reach out to me on Twitter, email. I think my email is pretty out there as well in the public domain. So feel free to reach out and ask us any questions that you might have on KAPE.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.